the head of pain and palliative care unit. I'm a palliative care physician, and I'll be one of your moderators today. With me is Anne Kirema. She's a registered nurse, and she's in charge of the patient affairs unit. She has a passion about patient-centered care, and she's going to be moderating with me. Now, we are privileged today to have on our panel Dr. Weru. Dr. Weru, please say good afternoon to the attendees before I introduce him.
I did not hear that part.
Oh, I said please greet the attendees before I go ahead to introduce.
Okay, good afternoon, participants. It's good to be in this discussion. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Weru is an associate professor at Aga Khan University Hospital. He's a palliative care physician. He helps the department. He's a chair of hospital. He's also a chairman of the board of Kenya Hospital and Palliative Care, and he's a mentor and tutor to many. Dr. Asaf, please greet the attendees before I introduce.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Asaf Kenyanjui. Good afternoon.
Yes, Dr. Asaf is the Chief Executive Officer for Nairobi Hospice. He's a board member for the Kenya Hospital and Palliative Care Association. He's a palliative care provider, and he has great interest in public and global health. Fleming, please say good afternoon to the attendees.
Good afternoon, members.
Yes, Fleming is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. He's a senior legal advisor, and this is the team that is going to take us through the discussion about euthanasia. So I'll start off with Dr. Weru. Dr. Weru, please tell us about definitions and types of euthanasia, and basically just what the understanding of euthanasia is.
Thank you, Esther, and I hope I'm clear enough.
Yes.
Okay, so the term euthanasia has been there for quite some time, and its definition is still evolving, and some words are being expired, others are being added. But in a simple term, euthanasia itself means the intentional ending of the life of a person who is suffering from an incurable and or a painful disease at his or her request. And those are two very important components when you are defining euthanasia, and we come up as we continue the discussion. So the intention is very important, and the request from the patient is also extremely important. But we also know that sometimes it's called the mercy killing. And there's been so many types of euthanasia that are talked about. And for the sake of our discussion today, there's active euthanasia, whereby the doctor terminates the life of a patient, for example, by injecting a substance that will lead to the death of the patient, a lethal drug that can end the life of the patient. So that is active euthanasia. Now, there is passive euthanasia, whereby intentionally letting a patient die by withholding artificial life support, such as ventilator or feeding tube. So there is a commission in active euthanasia, and there is an omission in passive euthanasia. So those are two important parts when we talk about euthanasia and types of euthanasia. But then we go to other types you might see in literature, that there could be voluntary euthanasia, whereby the patient has requested euthanasia itself. Remember, our definition had the patient request and the intention. And then there's non-voluntary euthanasia, where the patient is incompetent. The patient is not in a capacity and competent enough to make a decision, and we don't know what their preferences are when it comes to euthanasia. For example, a patient who is in a coma and has met a criteria of euthanasia and a decision is made for them, then this will be called non-voluntary euthanasia. But also, there could be involuntary euthanasia, where a patient is killed against his or her will. And of course, you know that this will be called, quote unquote, murder, if the patient's life is terminated without their request and their will. Now, let's not go to direct euthanasia because it is directly related to being active, and indirect might have some element of inactivity. But of importance is what is now called physician-assisted suicide. And in other countries, there is a term called medical assistance, all assisted in death, whereby a physician will facilitate a patient's death by providing the necessary means. You provide the means, or you provide the information to enable the patient to perform the ending act of their life. For example, if you are to tell a patient you can take 20 pills, sleeping pills, or you give them, you tell them a little dose of any drug, then this will be physician-assisted suicide. Those are basically, broadly speaking, the definitions of what euthanasia would be. And of note is the active, passive, and physician-assisted suicide. Now let's delve on argument for euthanasia later on when we come to discussion about the support for and against. Back to you, Esther. Esther?
Are you able to hear us?
Now we can hear you.
Okay.
Oh, Esther, you are lost again. There must be something wrong with your sound volume.
With our sound. And now?
Yes, yes, yes.
Now we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Taweru, for your good insight about the definition of euthanasia. Please tell us how euthanasia became a thing to be discussed. Where did this movement of euthanasia start?
Thank you, Dr. Nafula. And is it possible for me to share the screen?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nafula, and the team for organizing this discussion. It's quite timely, and especially that we're having an increase in individuals suffering from life-threatening conditions, and they will end up with a lot of suffering that will require, or they might request euthanasia. From the history perspective, this started from ancient Greece or Rome, and this was also way before even Christ. And euthanasia comes from a Greek word, eu means good, and dantos means death. If you look at in the olden days when they used to hang individuals, security personnel would actually pull individuals' legs to hasten their deaths once they are hanged. And even if you reflect again the actions during the World War, again, some soldiers who are severely wounded would be killed as an act of ending their suffering. And this happened in both World War I and World War II. In 1870, Samuel Williams proposed the use of the anesthetic and morphine for intentionally end patients' life. And in 1885, American Medical Association officially opposed the voluntary euthanasia that was being proposed in their country. And in the 19th century, then morphine again was introduced, and chloroform as some of the medications was to facilitate euthanasia. And in 1911, actually, there's a woman who had a challenge with her lungs, and she requested for euthanasia, and the Shakos community were able to facilitate that request. In 1935, then there was a lot of movement, and that led to Voluntary Euthanasia Legalization Society, which was founded in England. And in 1936, a bill was introduced in the Britain's House of Lords to facilitate euthanasia. Unfortunately or fortunately, this bill didn't pass. But in 1952, Euthanasia Society petitioned the United Nations so that they could amend the Declaration on Human Rights and to include euthanasia. Again, this wasn't factored in. Of interest that even the church also picked up this discussion, and in 1957, the Vatican proclaimed that passive euthanasia was acceptable. And in 1974, the Society for the Right to Die was established in America and became vocal in advocating for euthanasia. In 1976, the Supreme Court ruled again on a case which was looking at Quinlan, a 21-year-old, and it allowed the healthcare providers to remove the supportive respirator for a coma patient. And that was a key milestone in terms of the court decision supporting euthanasia. Again, church was heavily again involved in this discussion, and in 1980, Pope John Paul II issued the Declaration of Euthanasia opposing mass killing, but he permitted increase in use of analgesics. Again, in America, in 1982, there was a case that was looking at Dr. Jack. And interesting, Dr. Jack was being referred as a doctor of death because he used to facilitate many requests for euthanasia. And he performed one case on a live television, and that led to him being arrested and was jailed for 25 years, and later on died after serving the life sentence. In 1984, the American Medical Association supported withholding or withdrawing life-prolonging medical treatment in certain circumstances, and this, Dr. Wero has mentioned the aspect of either participating or not participating. In 1994, Oregon became the first state to legalize aid in dying in states. And there was a court case which took 3 years, and finally this legalization took effect in 1997. At the same time, President Clinton prohibited use of the public funds for assisted suicide. So you can see now the government also being heavily engaged and sometimes opposing some of these issues. If we move closer, the first country to legalize euthanasia was Netherlands in 2001. Belgium followed in 2002. There were also several states in US that legalized euthanasia, including Montana, California, New Jersey, Washington, and such. In 2008, again, there was also legalization of physician-assisted suicide, and I'm happy that Dr. Wero has already given us what that entails, and that was legalized in 2008. In 2009, South Korea are now even moving out of Europe or moving out towards Asia. The Supreme Court recognized the right to die within dignity and looked again to support a case for a brain dead patient who was in ICU, allowing the healthcare workers to commit or to offer the euthanasia services. In 2014, Mexico again also had interest in these issues, and there was a case that allowed physician-assisted suicide that was allowed by the Mexican courts. Belgium legalized euthanasia for terminally incurably ill children in 2014, and other countries have followed suit, including Canada in 2016, Hawaii 2018, Colombia 2021. In Africa, we are also not forgotten. South Africa courts in 2015 allowed assisted suicide for terminally ill patients. I think the recent country that has also allowed practice of euthanasia is Germany in 2020, after it overturned the ban that had restricted patient-assisted suicide. So again, if you look at the evolution, several things have changed in terms of practice. Before, what would happen is that medical personnel would initiate euthanasia. Like in the war, the soldiers would sort of kill the other soldiers who were severely wounded. And there's a case where the French soldiers actually ended up slitting throats of the wounded soldiers just to hasten their deaths and relieve the suffering. In Africa, we also had very interesting practices that could be interpreted as euthanasia. Like the pastoralist community, when they are migrating, they would end up leaving the sick one behind to die alone. And in some instances, some of these individuals who are very sick will be taken into the middle of the forest and be left there to be eaten by the wild animals as a form of relieving their suffering. Again, one of the other milestones that happened is that when things became a bit, legal actions were being introduced, what would happen is that the healthcare workers would not play a very active role, but would give the patients the medication they need to administer to hasten their death, but they will not be actively involved in it. But that brought an aspect of unfairness, because there are some patients who are in coma and they are not able to self-administer. And that led to, again, to a movement that advocated for involvement of healthcare workers, either in administering the medications, removing the supportive equipment, documentation, research, and publication. And Dr. Wero has already given us a bit of background in terms of how healthcare workers have participated in this. So in brief, that's the history of euthanasia and the evolution. I'm sure we'll be able to continue this discussion to look at some of the issues that might prohibit the practice of euthanasia. Thank you, Dr. Nafula. Dr. Nafula, over to you.
Hello.
We can't hear the moderators. We can't hear the moderators.
Okay. Dr. Asaf, can you hear us now?
Yeah, we can hear you now, but you're a bit faint.
We will try and change the machine that we're using. But meanwhile, would like Fleming to delve into the legal aspects within our setup. Mr. Fleming, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. You can at least tell us what is happening in the corridors of the law within Kenya.
Let me begin by prefacing my presentation by really pointing out that there exists no concrete law as at now governing or regulating the end of life issues in Kenya, and more particularly the hospital environment in which you work, especially on issues to do with euthanasia for terminally ill patients, or even on the question of do not resuscitate. Now, allow me to point out that the gap that exists in the law leaves the terminally ill patients or even the medical practitioners yourself in difficult situations, such that no patient really can ascertain the limits of his rights or even his autonomy, and how best perhaps maybe to safeguard his or her inherent right to dignity, as enshrined in the Constitution. Now, if you look at the primary law in the Kenyan context, that is the Constitution, it has been termed as one of the most progressive laws in the continent, or rather the world, because of the dimensions in terms of Bill of Rights that is within the Constitution itself. It outlines the guiding principles that regulate the social coexistence and human rights in Kenya. And particularly Article 26.3 of the Constitution that talks about the right to life, and really prescribing the limits to which one can go. Now, Article 26 basically indicates that every person has the right to life. And apart from that, when that particular life begins, and that again, no person whatsoever can be deprived of this particular life intentionally, except to the extent authorized by the Constitution or any other written law, then going ahead to prescribe, make prescription for abortion in terms of its permission. Now, the effect, the net effect of this is that the right to life shall not be limited except to the extent that the law authorizes or permits. Now, this particular limitation is expounded under Section 203 and as read together with Section 204 of the Penal Code, which provides that any person who with malice aforethought or even pre-planned conceived idea plans the death of another or causes the death of another commits what we call murder and is liable to be sentenced to death. Now, this one normally expresses instances in which one can be deprived of life upon the pronouncement by a competent court of law. So it creates the impression that an individual's right to life may be limited only upon being found guilty of murder. But this, however, does not fall within the province of the individual's liberty has been explained before. For one to make the decision of self-destruction, or maybe the decision to end his or her life in perhaps maybe circumstances of deterioration of a happy and normal state of life. So the question as to whether one's health can deteriorate to a point that self-deterioration or death becoming justifiable with the assistance of a medical practitioner is not yet acceptable in the Kenyan context or within the Kenyan society. So this results into more or less professional and perhaps, if I may call it, ethical dilemma for the Kenyan medical practitioners whenever a situation such as this arises, or whenever they are called upon, for example, where the situation of euthanasia perhaps maybe manifest itself. So the professional and the ethical dilemma in this particular context is understood as a gap between the professional obligation and the responsibility of the healthcare professionals and the efficacy of the health system that we have as at now. Now, I was doing some background checkup, and I came across the Kenya Medical Practitioners and Dentists Council, the Israel board, which is charged ideally with the mandate of governing or regulating the conduct of medical practitioners in Kenya. And in the past, they have held that euthanasia is a criminal offense and has no space within the Kenyan medical practice context. So whereas the right to life under Article 26, 3 of the Constitution of Kenya guarantees its limitation, euthanasia is not expressly recognized as one such way of ending life in an open and democratic society such as Kenya. Now, when you also look at other documentation such as the patient charter, the Kenya National Patient Rights Charter, which guarantees really the right to the highest attainable standards and quality healthcare under Article 5, it affirms the constitutional provision of Article 43, again, that requires that every individual is entitled to a right to access proper and a proper and acceptable health standard. Now, going deeper into that particular document, the Patient Rights Charter, the Article 6 also of the same document affords the patient the right to refuse treatment as well. But this may have the close relation with euthanasia for a terminally ill patient in the form of rejecting life-saving, perhaps maybe machines, or even life-saving therapies, which would later result into death of the patient. Now, this notwithstanding, the initiation of death, right, in whatever form is frowned upon by the Kenyan laws and may lead to criminal prosecution. Particularly when you look at section 226 of the Penal Code, it prohibits the suicide of any form or nature. Now, at the beginning of the presentation, I think it's Dr. John Weru who began the presentation by characterizing euthanasia and other forms of euthanasia. And we have had the assisted death, medical suicide as some of the forms or terms that are used to make reference to the euthanasia as a whole. So the section 226, if I may quote it, provides that any person who attempts to kill himself is guilty of a misdemeanor, and that any person who procures another to kill himself or counsels another to kill himself or aids another to kill himself is guilty of a felony and is liable to imprisonment for life. So should it therefore be evidenced that the refusal of treatment is calculated in such a way to achieve death in Kenya, then it may be potentially be classified as suicide. And apart from that, even aiding suicide in the face of section 226 of the Penal Code may be classified as a misdemeanor and a criminal offense. Now, just to cap it up, from this particular discussion and from the reviewed law that exists currently, the Kenyan law prohibits suicide. The Kenyan law prohibits any attempt to effect suicide, and it attracts the legal consequences of imprisonment. Again, given the silence of the law, there is a need for the establishment of, let me say, various frameworks in order perhaps maybe to keep in tandem with the changing society. But there is also what we call the judgment laws, for instance. Now, not everything is normally prescribed within the confines of the law, but we have the courts that have been developing jurisprudence day to day on health matters, and particularly when you look at what is being churned out from our courts. Now, regrettably, in Kenya, litigation has not gone as far as euthanasia is concerned. The only perhaps maybe far-reaching suit that we have had so far is on the question of abortion, and perhaps maybe that litigation surrounded the right to life, particularly section 26 on the right to life, but restricted to the abortion. But we draw also a lot from other foreign countries, in this case, the common law practice. Now, there are instances that were mentioned, basically from the UK, the US, the Switzerland, South Africa. Now, there are interesting cases that comes out of this particular jurisdiction in terms of to what extent do they allow euthanasia, for example. Now, even in those particular states or instances where it is allowed, it is not just given blanketly, but there are stringent measures that has to be taken into account in order, for example, that euthanasia to be achieved. Now, of particular interest is, I want to just give a few cases. One in the US, just to cover that particular area. I also want to just mention in passing about two, maybe from the UK, and perhaps maybe South Africa, because we seem to be drawing a lot in terms of comparative legal studies with South Africa and UK because of the common law practice. But just to mention, now there is an instance in the US. Now, this is in 1993. This is a case that is handled by the Superior Court in Thor versus Superior Court 1993. Now, in this particular case, some doctors and terminally ill patient sought to have what was termed the physician-assisted suicide, so as to shorten the suffering and die in dignity. So there is that particular right to dignity that is being espoused. Now, in unpacking these particular rights, you will find arguments being made that in unpacking the right to life, you have to equate it also to include the right to choose when and how to die, or the right to die. Now, they approach the court to help them in unpacking this so that they die in dignity. But the Superior Court, the Supreme Court, denied this because the law then, this was in Washington State. The law in Washington State made it an offense for a doctor to prescribe medicine in order to assist a patient to die. So this was at the first instance court, which declared this. Now, there is the one in the Supreme Court of the US. This is the Cruzan versus Director of Missouri State Department of Health. In this particular case, a patient who was in persistent vegetative state following head injuries that he suffered in a motor vehicle accident sought to have her artificial feeding and hydration tubes disconnected. Now, somebody made this particular application on his behalf to the court. Now, the court basing its decision on the common law rule on the battery held that a competent person has the constitutionally right to be protected. That is the right of liberty, interest in refusing unwanted medical treatment. But however, the court refused to accept that such a right could be exercised by a surrogate, or rather could be exercised by somebody else on your behalf or on his behalf. So that the Supreme Court holding that forcibly, perhaps maybe doing the injection of medication into somebody who has not consented, or an unconsenting person's body, represent a substantial interference with the person's liberty. Now, the jurisprudence here that develops is this, that yes, in certain jurisdiction, euthanasia is being allowed, but who is entitled to make that particular decision? Is it you, the guardian? Is it the patient? Or is the patient in the capacity to make that particular decision? So there are certain stringent rules that are being put in place by the judge-made law, for instance. Now, in the UK, there's the Suicide Act that criminalizes euthanasia. Now, there was the mention of the Voluntary Euthanasia Society and the arguments that they have made. And there's also the religious perspective and the arguments that they have made. Now, in the case of Republic versus United Kingdom, from which we also draw a lot of legal comparison, we note that the applicant had applied to be allowed. In this particular case, the applicant had been convicted by the court and sentenced to imprisonment. I suppose the applicant was a doctor or a health service provider. He was sentenced for imprisonment for aiding and abetting the suicide. And again, also the conspiracy to do so with the person who perhaps maybe sought his services to help do this. So he brought a complaint that his conviction and the sentence having been made under this particular act constituted a violation of his right to respect for his private life under the Convention for European Convention on Human and People's Rights. Now, and also on the right to express himself. But the court did not find that to be the case because there was an element of taking away the individual's life, for example. Now, again, in the UK, there are various cases again. Now, there is one known as the Glass versus United Kingdom. And here, the applicant, the hospital had taken a decision to withdraw a treatment because the patient was not responding. So the applicant went to court alleging that the decision taken by the hospital authority then and the doctors with respect to the treatment of the applicant had interfered with the applicant's right and respect for the personal integrity. So the applicant here whose right was being protected by the mother who was the second applicant was a child with severe mental and physical disabilities. Now, this particular child required round-the-clock attention. And apart from that, the second applicant, who is the mother, brought this particular case. Now, this particular incident happened following an operation to treat an upper respiratory tract obstruction. Now, the child suffered postoperative complication, which necessitated the use of a ventilator. Now, during the treatment, the staff at the hospital expressed their view to the effect that the child was dying, and apart from that, that there was no need for continued intensive care. So attempts by the hospital authority to persuade the family again to accept the discontinuation of the intensive care were rebuffed by the family members and particularly the mother of the child. So the doctor chose to the medallion do not resuscitate, the DNR that you people normally prescribe order. So without the consent of the mother. So this became a point of litigation at the court. And indeed, some of the occasions during the treatment, the testimony of the mother was that at some of the occasions, the doctors refused to resuscitate the child or the first applicant. So the family were always apprehensive and suspicious that the hospital wanted their child dead. And the hospital again wrote to the applicant indicating that there was not much that they could do at the end of the day. So if you look at these particular cases that I have pointed out, the UK law, the common law, places high premium on the question of the consent of the patient or the person responsible, except in emergency situation. So the court took the dim view of the hospital's defiance or the hospital's objection at the end of the day by the second applicant and noted that an inference with the first applicant's right of respect to private life, and in particularly the right to physical integrity was being violated by the court, by the hospital and the staff itself. And the court awarded them damages. Now, there are various cases that I can point out that border the question of euthanasia. For example, there is one that I need just to point out first, which is the Preti versus the United Kingdom. And here, the applicant was paralyzed again. The applicant suffered from degenerative illness, which were deemed incurable. She sought immunity for her husband from the prosecution in case her husband assisted her to commit the suicide, which request was not granted by the state. So she alleged that the refusal by the state to grant her and her husband the immunity from prosecution amounted to a breach of her rights. Now, the court indicated that there is no negative right to die. There is no negative right to die. And apart from that, the question of wanting to die again, it doesn't give the individual what I call the right to choose either death over life. So the court was extinguishing that ability of the individual to take away or to be assisted to die in that particular case. So they indicate, the question is, when they are making this particular argument, they are indicating that I have the right to self-determination. I have the right to determine how and when I need to die. But then there are other stringent measures that the court looks or puts in place in order, for example, to avoid a slippery slope where individuals, or to open the Pandora box for everyone now to become, to come in and shop death as and whenever the individuals want. Now, in the words of the judge who was sitting there, they were just emphasizing the sanctity of life by indicating that assisting someone to commit suicide, such as through medical intervention, whether through lethal injection or even withdrawal of treatment, is a crime. But the court again goes ahead to make or to create an exception to which the medical practitioners can find a room of an acceptable kind of euthanasia, where the court indicates that, however, the use of drugs to reduce pain is acceptable, even if such use ultimately hastens the death. What and your people call the double effect. You use it to reduce pain, but at the back of your mind, you know that really the use of this particular drug is effectively hastening the individual's death. So the dual effect is something that is also becoming acceptable. And that I bring it, for example, within the Kenyan perspective, that though our laws frown upon effective or active euthanasia, but there are instances where there are drugs that we use to relieve pain of patients who are terminally ill, which is acceptable within the medical cycles or the medical practice. So you are not necessarily committing a suicide or assisted death, but you are using it to cure the pain. But other than curing the pain, it is hastening the individual's death. So what is considered as, for example, an acceptable use of drugs or other medical intervention for express purposes of assisting suicide? But those that have the double effect, the judges have been free in terms of allowing it to be used. Now, in other instances where this have been litigated is in Switzerland, where it is active euthanasia is allowed, but it is done under very stringent conditions that have been developed by the court. So the obligation here, especially when you look at the cases that are coming out in Switzerland, for example, we have the one known as Haas versus Switzerland, where hello, where
Hello?
I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, Fleming, I want to interrupt you a little bit.
Okay.
There are questions coming in, and you have already discussed about DNR.
Yes.
Is DNR then legal? And what is the difference between DNR and euthanasia? Is there any difference between DNR and euthanasia, if any?
No. I don't know whether I'm the right person to answer the DNR issue, but what I want to determine at this particular point is this: that first and foremost, a do not resuscitate eventually would lead to death, for example. Now, when the family says that do not conduct any intervention that may, for example, prolong the life of this particular individual, in other instances, it may be, for example, be determined as one of the ways of assisting a patient to die. So in other words, legally, I would classify it under the euthanasia aspect, because there is an intervention by either omission or commission. Now, you have omitted from resuscitating this particular individual, which I want to bring that to the broader definition, or the broader definition of terms as put out by the first presenter, Dr. John Weru.
Thank you, Fleming. Thank you for that extensive discussion. I think you have touched on so many aspects of this discussion, and I will hand over to Dr. Nafula to ask a question for Dr. Weru.
Now, Dr. Weru, there are some questions coming in the chat, and most participants are feeling that a lot of patients with cancer, for example, are suffering from a lot of pain, and that euthanasia should actually be legal to allow them to be free of pain. And there's a participant asking, to whom does the life belong? Is it to the individual, the family, the state, the church, or the hospital? So maybe you can touch on that as you tell us a bit about arguments for euthanasia, and then we will go to Dr. Asaf as we go on with the Q&A. We hope to wind up the session soon also.
Okay. Thank you, Esther. And I believe those are pertinent questions that are coming in. Now, when you talk about euthanasia, we are talking about an ethical and moral dilemma, coupled with legal and social dilemma. Because you're talking about two ends of a spectrum. You're talking about respecting the patient's autonomy versus the two principles that guide the physician, which are beneficence to the benefit of the patient, and non-maleficence, first of all, do no harm. And one is what we call respect for the person. Personhood has become so critical that you cannot deal with the person next to you without respecting them. Whatever used to be called respect for autonomy. And one of the biggest arguments for euthanasia is the fact that terminally ill patients need suffering to end and have a dignified death. In this case, the proponents for euthanasia are talking about two great values when a physician is dealing with a patient: the value of respect and the value of dignity. And these two values do guide what we do next with our patients when we are treating them. Now, realize that it's also critically important to know that when you look at a terminally ill patient, don't we see the fact that it's immoral to let a terminally ill patient die in agony? We have a moral duty to make sure that they don't die in agony. If by ending their life at that point will end their agony, then it could be justified. So to whom do you owe a duty? It's the patient. The fact that something is illegal does not make it unethical. Look at the Hippocratic Oath. It guides the physician in dealing with the patient. And it is also critical to know that if we are talking about do no harm, my continued taking care of a patient who is struggling, less stressed, delirious, in pain, and my drugs are not working for that matter, am I not doing any harm? And I have the knowledge of not continuing this care that we are providing. It might also be argued that human beings have the right to die and in a way that they want. So long as the patient is competent according to the law and is in a capacity to make that decision according to the ethical component and connection with their physician. The intent, as we said in the definition, is clear beyond doubt. Remember, intention was very, very critical. And the request from the patient. There should be no other questions about it. So we can say a patient have got an explicit right to die. And that's a negative right, just like it is a negative right to live. Nobody deals or should to take away your life. Now, let's look at the choices that we make. Why are we not allowing this patient to make a choice at the end of life? And he made a choice when he got married, for example. He made a choice when he bought his car. He made a choice when he went to school, when he became a doctor, when he became an engineer. Why are we not allowing them to make a choice at this point of their life? It is still their life. At the end of life, it's still the patient's life. It is not the state's, the doctor's, or the hospital's life. So they should be allowed to make a decision at that point also. Also remember, death is a private matter. We don't join that person in dying. And there's no harm to others, to the state, to the clinicians. Then a libertarian will say, why do we interfere with it? Why should we interfere with it? Practically speaking, think about this person in front of you. What quality of life are we exposing these people to? What quality of life do they have? When we allow them to suffer just because of quote unquote, what we call sanctity of life, whose life are we talking about? And Kant, the philosopher, would argue that we are doing this for ourselves, not to the patient. And therefore, his rule is not being followed, that we should not use others as a means to an end. We should use them as a means in themselves. When we don't respect this request, we want to obey, for example, the law. We want to say that let's continue doing everything. We want to say it is about sanctity of life, but whose life is it? Now, also remember that legally speaking, it's very possible to regulate euthanasia, as you've heard from Fleming, as you heard from Asaf. It's been regulated, it's still being regulated. So if something can be regulated, then it should not be denied. Now, remember, we are in a resource limited situation, allowing people to die when they wish to die because of suffering. Remember, the intent and the request and meeting the criteria are very, very critical. We are going to free up scarce health resources. We should propose this also. When a patient is terminally ill, they want to die, and we are intubating them, we are taking them to the vent. But they had requested, we are taking up a resource that can be used by a patient who will go back to work and therefore become productive to the society. Also, remember the fact that someone need to tell me, is death a bad thing? And if it is, to whom? To whom do you owe the duty? It's to that person. Will they know it is bad? Or is it us who are looking at it as a bad thing? It's very critical to know that. Now, justice demands that we give and have access equitably of what should be provided and what is available at that point, given the context. So we could argue that according to the justice principle, it would be unjust to deny a patient to aid their pain and their suffering. Pain is in the environment of the patient. Let's remember, the suffering is in the environment of the whole society, the family, and everybody else who is a loved one to the patient. How many of us see members of families and patients who come to see the patient who are terminally ill, in pain, restless, delirious, who don't know where they are, maybe even those in permanent vegetative state in our hospitals? We realize that we are doing harm, not only to the patient, but also to the families who see them suffering. And that's why you'll hear even religious is saying, let him rest. He suffered, he should be allowed to rest. So we should look at these principles we so abstractly and reductionally look at and apply them in allowing the patient to access the request for euthanasia. And euthanasia needs to be differentiated from do not resuscitate. DNR is a physician order. It's in the realm of the physician. Euthanasia is in the realm and the environment of the patient, because the starting point for euthanasia is not the physician. It is the patient who requests. He is the requester. DNR is a physician order. These two are totally different. I wish to stop at that point. Thank you.
Now, Dr. Weru, just a question before you stop. There is a concern about actually when we get the request for euthanasia, now practically speaking, one participant wants to know whether it would be advisable to start giving the patients options that euthanasia is an option, so that they consent early, although we've already heard that in the Kenyan law it is illegal. But practically speaking, what do we do about requests for euthanasia from patients or their families?
A great question again, and remember, we won't and we don't practice in a vacuum. So the law is very great. We need to obey the law. What we need to do is to attentively listen to this request for euthanasia, trying to get the reason why this patient or the family are requesting for euthanasia. What is the motivation? What is it grounded on? Does the patient have enough information? Does the patient have enough high quality management for their symptoms? Have they accessed all the drug they should be able to access? Has the patient discussed this with the family, or is it the family? That the patient voluntarily have this request, or is there in some element of coercion? So we need to understand, attentively listening to the request and understanding where the patient is coming from is very critical, and seeing whether they have had all the options of the treatment for their symptoms, for their suffering, for their distress, Sometimes all we need to do is understand where the patient is coming from, and then we do advise on the given interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weru. We'll move quickly because of time. I would like Dr. Asaf to give us at least a few arguments against euthanasia. What do people say, why they are pro or against euthanasia? Dr. Asaf.
Thank you very much. As I practice palliative care, I receive requests from patients and families to offer the service of euthanasia. So it's also something that is very common in our practice. And as Dr. Weru mentioned, one of the things I usually do is to look at the reason why they are asking for this, making this request. In most of the instances is when they have uncontrolled symptoms or they have a lot of uncontrolled anxiety and other distresses. So if you're able to offer those sort of comfort, and then you sit down again with the patient and ask them whether they still want to end their life, most of them actually end up changing that perspective. We need also to appreciate that death is irreversible. So once you assist somebody to end their life, you can't, and they end up successful, that process is not reversible. And therefore that you also need to be very critical and careful as we proceed. We remember as we practice, again, we practice within the confines even of the religious practices and spiritual practices. And we know, we believe, our majority of our patients, even ourselves, we believe that life is sacred and we don't own it, but the creator has a right to when the life commences and when life ends. And therefore it should not be us as the practitioners to make that decision when to terminate, or even giving the patient the powers to make that decision when to terminate their life. And I think even in some instances, there is violation of patients' rights, including even the autonomy, where sometimes family members will want to initiate the discussion and the process of euthanasia without the full consent of the patient. And therefore, we really need to look at how best do we protect our patients' autonomy, because sometimes families, they feel they are tired, they don't want no longer continue providing care to their loved one. Maybe the loved one has properties and they feel this person is staying in this earth for too long and they no longer want to wait before they could get their inheritance. And therefore, if you allow the practice of euthanasia, then you realize you bring families into very awkward and conflicting situations where individuals would want even to terminate their loved one's lives because of their own sort of selfish interest. And as Fleming mentioned, in this country, it is illegal again, and there are some instances where individuals have been taken to court and imprisoned because of acting or assisting in terms of assisting individuals' death. So again, it will be very sad to see us as healthcare practitioners being taken to court by either by the state or by the family members because of practicing something that is illegal. But finally, I think we have a solution to all these challenges, and that is the introduction of palliative care services in our facilities. Because if you introduce palliative care services, then you'll be able to improve the quality of life of the patient. You reduce the pain and other distressing symptoms. You'll be able to counsel the patient and the family members. And with that, then you end up improving the quality of life of the patient and the family, and therefore hence no need for instituting euthanasia. So my appeal to all is to also look from the other perspective of what other solutions are we giving to these patients and the families, so that at least we don't just tell them euthanasia is illegal and we walk away, but let us offer them quality palliative care services to improve their quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asaf, for even delving into the issue of quality of life and allowing the patient to have that opportunity. Now, Dr. Weru, you can make your comment.
Okay, thank you, Esther. and thank you for this discussion. Now, sometimes, as Asap is saying, it's important to make sure that we do understand where the patient is coming from and provide the quality palliative care and end of life for patients. And as clinicians, we also need to recognize that the care of the patient and the relief of their suffering is not purely medical. It's not only a medical concern. Although they are physical, there could be mental, spiritual, social, psychological elements in the patient's concern. And when they come to us, let's be holistic. Let's use a multidisciplinary team approach for this care that we do for our patients. You realize giving supportive palliative care, quality end of life care will ameliorate what the patients and the families are going through. Now, if the symptom at the end of the day become refractory to any medical intervention that we are doing, we also have an option for palliative sedation. We use certain medication to sedate the patient so that they are not in distress, they are not in pain. And this has been shown to be something that makes the patient to have some quality at the end of life. In situations like KNH and at Aga Khan and some other hospitals, but also catching up within the public health sector, we have a resource called Hospital Ethics Committee. Let's inform them when you have these requests coming from patients, from families. They are able to pick some of the nuances and the particularities in a patient's case, in a single given patient case, and they're able to assist us come up with the best way forward. Also remember the fact that, to me, I do take it that we talk about the doctrine of double effect, the dual effect, that we do give medications which are very strong and good for pain, but they also hasten death. The intent was not to hasten death. The term intent is very important when you're talking about end of life. It was to relieve suffering. And remember, these drugs are prescribed according to the dosage and the requirements of the patient. So if the dosage is done well, they might not lead or hasten to death. They are likely, yes, to cause severe side effect, but to cause death when prescribed properly, but by people with the skills and the knowledge to do so, they might not. So the doctrine of double effect might just be a fallacy out there when we're dealing with this given patient at this point of their life. At the end of the day, it's critical to ask ourselves, did we fully understand about this request coming from the patient? And then the issue of ethics and law, which informs the other. The ethics inform the law, but ethics has got context in it. There's a question about, can something be illegal and be ethical? Because you bring in the context. The legal statutes are text, contextualize the text, and that's why it is context. Think about abortion. It's illegal in our country, but we sit down sometimes and say it can be permitted. It can be permitted in situation A, B, C. And we also look forward to having these open discussions about the issues of end of life, euthanasia, and everything. To conclude, euthanasia might not be a right to die versus a right to life, because this give it a notion that you want to end life. It could be a right of choice. Thank you, Esther.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weru. Mr. Fleming, has time come for us to discuss this topic, even as we look at the law in Kenya? And has it even happened? Are you aware about any discussions about this topic in the corridors of justice, or in other words, to repeal our laws?
Now, allow me to state this. Now, there is no I wonder why. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I think time is right for us to discuss the question of euthanasia. Now, just like in the issue of abortion and the provision being inserted in our constitution, there were a lot of resistance, both from the religious perspective of the inclusion of permitting abortion in certain circumstances within our laws. But nonetheless, it is the law as it is right now. Now, I think what comes out from the discussions we have had is the frequency with which patients, family members, or even guardians are opting for euthanasia or requesting for euthanasia. That means that the individuals have beginning to accept that there comes a time that we need to discuss the end of life issues. And that now becomes a challenge to not only the lawyers or even the society, but also to the physicians as yourself, that don't leave the law to the lawyers only, but each and every individual in the society is mandated to test the limits of the application of the law as it is today. Now, most of the reforms that comes up in law nowadays is not because the Constitution or even the acts permitted these particular acts before, but it comes as a question of how far can the law be stretched to accommodate the societal changes. Now, this is a societal changes, and because of the changes that we experience, it is important that we begin to moot the idea of reforming our health laws or even approaching the health committee in the parliament with a draft legislative proposal on the question of euthanasia and end of life issues in order to help us issue or give out quality healthcare, not only to ourselves during our prime time, but also at the end of life. So we have to test the limits of the law by, one, instituting cases in court, for example. Now, your organization or the medical council can institute a public interest litigation in court for the question of interpretation or even unpacking the right to life per se, whether it includes also the right to choose when and how to die in certain circumstances. Now, you realize that towards the end of presentation before I was cut short, I was alluding to the fact that we have the judge-made laws. Now, the judgment laws is just to say specifically that you may not have, for example, express provision within our laws or even the Constitution that expressly allows for euthanasia or any other act. But by way of interpreting the laws, then you find the accommodation of euthanasia in certain circumstances. This is what I mean by approaching the court in order to test the limit of applicability of the laws per se. And that's why I did indicate that with respect to Kenya, we are yet to get any a question or any court case revolving around the question of euthanasia. It is a challenge to the organization, your organization, to help in terms of developing the law within the health sector or revolving around the health and ethical issues. I want to leave it at that.
Thank you, Fleming. And to finish up, maybe you give us the way forward on, someone has asked about advanced directives and the DNR and the legal framework. If there is any that we can apply for practicability and considerations, maybe you can help us going forward.
Now, for me as a way forward, I'll propose this. Now, one, we have come to a conclusion that there is the silence in law, and that particular silence need to be breached by way of establishing a legal framework that perhaps maybe sets out the question of euthanasia. There have been justifications that have been discussed in this particular forum, and the importance why sometimes families may resort to euthanasia, both from the philosophical, socio-economical perspective, in terms of justifying really why it's time we recognize euthanasia in Kenya. Now, those particular justifications are the ones that we need to lead so that we direct our efforts to the parliament for the purposes of enacting these particular legal frameworks that would address the issue of euthanasia, especially for terminally ill patients, to address their quality of life, because then it will set the limits and the limits of when and how perhaps maybe to address the question when it comes. So that when we set up this particular legislative framework, then the patients who are terminally ill will no longer then have to wait for perhaps maybe their deaths, perhaps maybe in the bed of condemnation, in the name of waiting for a natural death. I want to join issues with the presenter, with the rest of the presenters, in terms of not just looking at euthanasia as the only available option, but as palliative care practitioners, are there ways through which you can better the life of your patients? Now, if there are those particular ways, then let's put them into action. But that does not take away your role and our role, societal role, to enact and perhaps maybe bring out policies surrounding the use of euthanasia as a whole. So for me, my proposal is that other than the policy in itself, there needs to be a legislative framework that guides the resolve to use euthanasia as means of ending life, and how it's supposed to be regulated. Because when it is not regulated, again, that's why I talked about the slippery slope thing. An unregulated euthanasia may result into something else. And that's why there is need for those particular legislation. And apart from that, other than the legislation, I propose for your organization also to test the limit and to test the resolve of our court, because we have the international legislation that permits the use of euthanasia. And our courts have gone into these particular legislative instruments in order to bring certain principles that are not even within our constitution, but to read life into them and put them as part of our laws. So when we test the limits, then we may have regulation in a way based on judgment laws, and apart from that, the enactment of legislation. So there is need for us to test the limits and propose enactment for legislations.
Thank you so much for the wonderful discussion. We've come to the end of our session today. I've seen a lot of concerns about CPD points. Kindly send your queries to knh.research@gmail.com. Also, when you go to the KNH website under webinars, you'll get the recording of this session by tomorrow. Thank you so much for attending. We hope to host you soon for another great discussion. Have a good afternoon.